I'm talking about Holocene bidirectional river system along the Kenya Rift and its influence on East African faunal exchange and diversity gradients. This is a project which we published already last year, and I like to acknowledge all these people here listed. Without their creativity, this work wouldn't have been possible. So please be in mind, this is not the work of myself only. Yeah. So this map of East Africa, or the map of basically the entire African continent, you see the diversity of mammal species shown with different coloration, where red denotes high diversity and bluish low diversity. And if you look at this map, it's intriguing that the highest mammal diversity occurs along both arms of the East African Rift system. We can also look at birds, for instance, and the pattern may even be clearer. So something is special about the rift in terms of species diversity, that there are many species in various groups of animals, also for plants. And if you ignore the land, you can think about the lakes, which partly cover the rift. Think about Lake Tanganyika or Lake Malawi. They host some of the most diverse fish faunas. So East Africa, and in particular the Rift Valley, is truly a global biodiversity hotspot. In 2005, I think, when the journal Science turned 125 years, they published the 25 most pressing questions, in their opinion, for science. And one of those questions is, what determines species diversity? Yeah, so we can rephrase this and think about, okay, East Africa is a global biodiversity hotspot. So what determines species diversity there? So scientists have identified three modes of diversification, or the generation of biodiversity in this region in East Africa. One is allopatric speciation, that is speciation by geographic isolation. For instance, think about an animal ends up on Mount Kilimanjaro and stays there, and over thousands or millions of years becomes an endemic species there. Then there's a process of adaptive radiation, where a species diverges into many in the same region. This is particularly important for the evolution of fishes in the rift lakes. And then there's a process of biotic interchange, which is essentially exchange of species between distant regions during particular periods of times, when regions are connected by certain habitats or vegetation types, or rarely due to long distance dispersal. This last point is poorly studied in East Africa, and it requires a reconstruction of dispersal pathways. East Africa is not just, or the rift is not just relevant for diversity, but also it's intriguing if you look at the distribution of certain species. I just show here a couple of mammals. These are forest mammals, which occur mostly, you see in the larger maps of the African continent, in the Congo Basin or in Western Africa. And they have these isolated occurrences along the East African Rift. And some of them occur actually east of the Kenya Rift, along Mount Kilimanjaro, Mount Kenya, for instance. Yeah, this is, and I just show a couple of photos I took here, either in zoos or in the wild, of bongo, forest hawk, and black-fronted duiker. So how did these animals get there? How did they cross the rift? And maybe the godfather of African zoology, Jonathan Kingdom, already proposed a model in the early 70s, where he said these animals during some wetter period probably used a corridor either north of Lake Victoria, when there was forest extent, when there was a larger forest extent, and then reached the Kenyan Rift by that pathway, or there was a different pathway from the south via the Eastern Arc Mountains. The thing is, these proposed routes have not been tested independently by let's say, paleogeographical or paleoecological data. So we try to address these questions. In our study, we looked for a role of humid corridors and rivers in influencing biological interchange. So our approaches were to reconstruct past river activity and hydrological connectivity of Kenyan rift lakes for the so-called African humid period. That was the last wet climate phase in East Africa, about 12 to maybe 5,000 years ago. And we mapped rift lake basins in the South Kenya Rift and fluvial networks and integrated a large number of radiocarbon dates. We determined the degree of faunal exchange for fishes between East African river basins using fossil data and the reconstruction of river basin connectivity in the fluvial network. And then we tested Kingdon's model of a northern and southern dispersal route for forest fauna by integration of mammal fossil data, pollen data, and more modern distributional data. So I can say right away there two rivers existed in the Kenya Rift during this African humid period, starting around 12,000 years ago. On this map, you see the central and the southern Kenya Rift Valley and a number of lakes for the early Holocene. At this time, these lakes were very large, and these lakes were flowing over their outlet levels and formed a river system which originated basically in these Kenyan highlands. So we have a 450 kilometer long northern river and a 175 kilometer long southern river, which flew in opposite directions. And there was a little corridor across the Rift Valley, the so-called Gilgil corridor. That's the highest area of the rift today, a little bit more than 2,000 meters in elevation. And on this corridor, also mammal fossils provide evidence that this was actually a terrestrial dispersal corridor. My colleague Simon Riedel has mapped, in particular, the Menengai area, which is north of Lake Nakuru, which was a through-flow lake, so shows an inland and an outlet, and was one of the areas of the upstream areas of that northern river. We also dated and mapped areas in the South Kenya Rift. This is here in an area I showed on the map, which we call Siriata. It's around here. And in this area, we dated lake sediments, which show an abrupt onset of lake formation with the onset of the Holocene. We found fish fossils, which are from soda tilapias, fish species which are today confined to Lake Magadi and Lake Natron. So they show that fishes were actually dispersing via this river system upstream. We also found rounded pumices, which show that this pumice is produced probably by volcanic activity in the central Kenya Rift. These rounded pumices show that they were fluvially transported towards the south, and probably the most spectacular manifestations of these past rivers are these outlet gorges. One here, the Onyorova Gorge south of Lake Naivasha, and then this gorge at Lake Siriata, between Lake Siriata and Lake Magadi. So there's abundant field evidence that rivers existed there, both geomorphological, geochronological, and biological. So here in this complicated figure in the middle, I show these probability distributions for radiocarbon dates for all these lake basins, starting at 14,000 years, going back all the way to the present. And the dark blue areas show when a lake was overflowing. And the blue band shows the connection of these lakes, that is the existence of a river system. Yeah, and we go from basically, you can use the map as guidance where you are. And you see that most of these lakes started to form about 12,000 years ago and existed or flew, or they had lake levels over their outlet elevation or at their outlet elevation, so that they were overflowing into the adjacent basins up to about 8,000 years ago, maybe. Yeah. Wherever we also see the occurrence of radiocarbon dated fish fossils, which show the immigration of fish from the Nile. The northern river basin, or the northern river, was connected to the Nile. Yeah, this was known already that Lake Turkana had a connection to the Nile, but now we can make the case that this connection with the Nile extended all the way to the central Kenya highlands. Yeah. We also produced an oxygen isotope record for this Lake Siriata, which shows very subdued variability. So that means there was constant in and outflow into these through flow lakes, which suggests that these rivers were permanent in their existence. Yeah. So let's look into a longitudinal river profile here along the Kenya Rift. If you see the pointer, this is the Gilgil corridor, the highest area of the rift. This is the rift floor, the dark gray, and the light gray are the rift shoulders. Yeah, and you see in dark blue these lakes and how they were connected. Yeah, so.
René, you had 10 minutes now.
Okay, please take a look at these numbers here. This is these numbers show the present number of fish species in each of those lakes, and behind the second number is the number of endemics, and below is the percentage of Nile species in these lakes. Yeah, and so our reconstruction demonstrates that the northern rivers was connected with the Nile, and Nilotic species were able to invade Kenyan rift lakes all the way to Lake Bogoria. And in the southern rift, there was no such connection. So these lakes have very low biodiversity and are only characterized by endemics. Just here, a sequence of the hydrological changes for the lake quaternary. This is the LGM, the entire Kenya Rift, except for two little basins or remnants of Lake Turkana. The whole Kenya Rift was dry. No lakes existed, so they were only reinvaded with the onset of wet conditions at the Holocene, when these lakes were large and connected by rivers, which allowed their immigration with species from fishes from other areas. And then today, all these lakes are isolated again, and species diverge if they had immigrated. On this map here, you see the East African extent of migration pathways for aquatic fauna, yeah, and their durations. And on these cladograms, you see with the gray area highlighted when these lakes were actually connected by river activity. So until about 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, there was a connection. And once this connection was disrupted, these lakes existed isolated as isolated basins, and the fauna then diverged phenotypically and genetically. Yeah, and the existence of subspecies of Nile tilapia, for instance, in Lake Turkana, in Lake Baringo, and Lake Bogoria is proof that this is actually happening over very short times. Just the last point is the fauna. We talked about Kingdon's dispersal routes. We tested those. The thing is that the northern route was actually disrupted by the opening of the Victoria Nile, which started to flow about 13,000 years ago. Pollen data indicate the existence of a forest corridor there, and the most likely place where these animals cross the rift is the Gilgil corridor, the only terrestrial pathway, which was also more wooded. The river otherwise acted as a barrier. A second dispersal pathway was basically the drainage divide between the Lake Victoria basin and the basins, the river basins to the south. Yeah. So in conclusions, we can say biodiversity assembly in East Africa was strongly influenced by past river activity. There's a dual role for rivers. They acted both as barriers and as corridors for the dispersal of either aquatic or terrestrial fauna. Humid periods, or the African humid period, induced lake overflow with that river formation and the connectivity of drainage basins. And the rift morphology determined essentially the river flow directions. And the Holocene patterns and processes which are presented here are essentially a model for Pleistocene biogeography. So with that, I want to thank you. I want to mention briefly this contribution to Smithsonian's Oligocylate Drilling Project, and we acknowledge the local communities of the Maasai, which helped us doing this work. Stay tuned. University of Potsdam, Manfred Strecker's group, and the Smithsonian are still active. I'm still involved. If you're interested in this paper, there's the DOI number, and you can contact me with that email.
Excellent. Thank you very much, René. If you have a question, just raise your hand, type Q in the chat, or, well, that's the options. We have one question. Debayan, ask it yourself, please.
Yeah, I guess I just had a small point that we saw like these nice reconstructions of the lakes and all these river systems through the East African Rift Valley. So just one question is that, are these reconstructions based on the modern day topography as we see it now, or you somehow had created paleodms of the area and then sort of calculated the channel network and the lake extents and so on?
Yeah, thanks for your question. This is certainly an important point. We did not use any kind of reconstruction of paleotopography simply because it's very difficult. And we think that this is, again, for the early Holocene, so we only go 10,000 years ago. I would not do that, obviously, for earlier periods in time because of deformation and so on, and volcanism and all kinds of things. We still think that the main morphology of the rift has not changed substantially over these periods of time. There's evidence of river channels, which you can trace if you go along the rift, which basically essentially is proof that there was river flow at this time. I agree that certain details of the fluvial reconstruction are based, because they're based on the modern topography or the modern DMs, which were not adjusted, maybe slightly different in reality. But this is work. If somebody likes to do that, happy. I'm just skeptical whether good data available for this period of time. And yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I understand your point. Yeah. Thank you.